one of the people that they arrest under spurious charges, who they've already tried to banish back to the Transkei, which is where he's supposed to come from, and they've removed his capacity to be a medical student as part of his punishment, is this man, Stephen Bantu Biko, who was born in 1946, just before the apartheid government came into being. And by the early 70s, he's a mature thinking, extremely agile, nimble-minded man who's able to move across these different groups with great capacity. And it's almost as if he becomes their target. And we can't go into the whole story here, but after a series of episodes of extremely gross torture, they put him into the back of a paddy wagon, and the police move him around a whole series of areas in the Eastern Cape, and then decide to drive him to a prison where he's going to be further tortured in the Gauteng area. And in the course of that journey, his head injuries deteriorate. And what actually happens at the end of this, Stephen, is that he dies. And the government immediately tries to pretend that he either killed himself by maniacally jumping around or resisting treatments that were being offered, or in fact, he had underlying health conditions, and that's why he didn't make it. And they draw upon the power of people who have taken the Hippocratic Oath, who have been educated as doctors and are now doctors in their employ, and they try and get these doctors to sign off on documentation to say that it wasn't the government's fault that he died. And the fact that 3 doctors actually cooperate in this appalling scheme is absolutely petrol to a fire. Because when Stephen Bantu Biko's death is announced, and when the pretense is put out that he was, that he died of natural causes, this lie is so intolerable. It is so unspeakable that it causes a mass reaction, not only in the community of young people who took him as their leader, not only in the community of people who had risen up in the 76 uprisings against the further harsh restrictions into the Bantu Education Act, not only in Joburg, not only in Pretoria, not only in the Cape, but all over the country, in rural and urban areas. People are not prepared to believe this anymore. His funeral is an enormous pageant of resistance against the state. The government tries to think about a way to ban his funeral. They cannot do it. Religious leaders, nuns, including middle-aged white nuns, every kind of person from every sector of Black society and white society feels revolted at this unless they are absolutely extreme white nationalists. And even white South Africans who had hitherto thought that the voices of Black South African youth in the Soweto uprising had been stoked into being by the Soviet Union and weren't really the views of young people and were always caused by meddling left-wing journalists. Even in middle-class suburbia, there is a reverberation. Oh my goodness, have we been blinded all along? And the energy, the fury and the energy that comes from his funeral seeps even into the very, sort of separated from all of this riffraff and all of this political noise of the medical establishment. And the Medical Association of South Africa is confronted with absolutely furious Black doctors, with absolutely furious colored Indian and Black South African nurses and doctors, but they are also confronted by, for the first time, a lot of white South African doctors, people like Philip Tobias and others who join with Jerry Arthur, who join with the Black South African doctors that are leading a lot of the health services in the country. And they are confronted with this fact: if you keep lying about how this man died, not only will we drag you through the courts, but we will actually sacrifice our own medical degrees. We will ask the world community to boot South Africa out of every single medical and dental association. Your degrees will be worth nothing. You will not be able to move around the world. You will not be legitimate in the eyes of international medicine. This is like a real wake-up call. South African doctors are going to have to choose. Do they choose the Hippocratic Oath? Do they actually look at how apartheid has affected health? Do they stop pretending that they can give the same excellent care to Black patients and white? Do they stop pretending that health is not political? Or do they actually begin to make very difficult choices, in which case they save, or they begin to try and save, not only South Africa's whole health system, and show a light on its inequalities, and remember what they believed in when they were young medical students? Do they do that? Do they form common cause with Black South African doctors and nurses? Do they treat all patients the same? Do they see the way in which apartheid is a kind of sickness? Do they do that, Stephen? Or do they turn their back on that? and then risk being the polecat doctors of the world? Do they risk, in fact, being stripped of all of the power that they consider so important in their biomedical performance, which is international scientific credibility? And that's the moment that the South African government passes into law in Parliament an act they've been working on for about 4 years. It's the 1977 Public Health Act. It's the first big reformulation of public health since 1919, except counting the 1928 Act, where they professionalize the disciplines, and all of the health acts passed in the Bantustanes, which fragment health responsibilities. Do you know what the germ of the 1977 Act is? It speaks to the Republic of South Africa, so it's pretending to ignore all the Bantustanes. It divides the purse of health this way. Provinces will be responsible for all hospitals and therefore all curative care. And they'll get the lion's share of the purse, Stephen. Small amounts of money will go to local authorities, and they will deal with all preventative care and clinic-based care and vaccination and all community care. So they actually instantiate into white South Africa and urban Black South Africa, as in Black South Africans allowed to and tolerated in South Africa. They actually put into law the opposite of what their own evidence has shown, which is that they should put as much money or good resources into preventative care. And this is when white South Africans are dealing with lots of heart problems, with smoking-related issues, with obesity, kidney disease, with stress, all the sorts of things that we need to be dealt with at the primary and preventative level. They skew the decision towards curative medicine, and they help to propel in the years that follow a movement into private care and specialized care for whites as well. So actually the health of white South Africans, which had really improved in the 50s and 60s, after the 70s and 80s, it actually begins to decline again because they're not putting resources in the right place. They are not making decisions based on science. They are making decisions based on protecting certain kinds of assets for certain kinds of medical facilities. And this is the landscape of deep contradiction that South Africa is in by 1977.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking to think about, and the tragedy of Steve Biko's death, I think, still has resonance with us today. I'm really glad that you mentioned Mampela Rampere, who's a hero of mine as an anthropologist, and the work that she's done. And very often, I think women are still kept on the margins of a lot of the work that resistance work that happened, perhaps during the period.
I hope people read her book as well. Her book, which is about her formation as a memoir, as well as they read I Write What I Like, which were the collected together at the time banned writings of Biko. You'll see the way in which her intellect and the intellect of people like Biko are co-forming, along with people like Frank Chikani, a very important thinker called Pregs Govender, who is an Indian South African woman from Durban who later ended up in Parliament, and our current, as members of our current cabinet, people like Pravin Gordhan, how they were all co-creating this body of texts around Black consciousness. Very easy for people to think that there was only one singular hero. I haven't underplayed his power at all and his singularity, but he was part of a community of thinkers building solidarity, and so many of these people were medical professionals, Stephen.